All right, let's resume the presentation. So we had a question in the thread from somebody that's new to this session, saying, you're throwing all this information at me. I'm a little confused about kind of how do I think about this situation overall. And that's a fair question, and it's easier if you've been in a few of these sessions. We're going to clarify that for you here in a few slides that we get into in this section. A little bit in section 5, but mostly in this section, we'll clarify some of that for you. So I want, but just keeping kind of the concept, the big picture is that we in that 2022 and 2023 timeframe, kind of like we showed earlier, and let me go up a little bit first, and I'll show you. I'll use this as a picture. Actually, this isn't bad. If you were to invert this and make it a mountain, that with that January 2023, this area down here as the peak. So if you just flip it on the economy peaked at that time. We were at full employment. I'll show you the wages information soon. It showed that we had very strong historical wages. In terms of net worth, even adjusted for inflation, Americans became the richest ever in 2022. Not only the bottom 50% group, but the other groups as well, because you had both housing and stock prices going up at the same time. We hit this mountain peak. It's as good an economy as you can get. Despite all the noise about this crisis or that crisis, that was an absolutely, really, all the planets aligned for the economy in that 2022 2023 timeframe. And now we're coming off that peak, so you're starting to see 1,400,000 more unemployed versus that peak since December 2022. So over the last 2 years, that number has crept up, and so we're over that peak and starting to come down the hill a little bit, but we're still way up high. And so that's kind of where I would summarize it using that mountain analogy. We're still near the peak, we're just coming off the peak. Now let's talk about wages and income and stuff that affects kind of at the household level. Since before the pandemic, which is February 2020 was sort of the last month that was unaffected by the pandemic. So that was sort of peak Trump. That was like the best economy. Trump called 2018 and 2019 the greatest economy ever. I would say 2022 and 2023 were even better than that. But they were close. Let's put it that way. What's happened is that hourly wages have climbed about 27%. And this is for workers. This is the bottom 80% of the private sector workers. Hourly wages are up 27%. Inflation's up 22% over that time. So wages have outgrown inflation. And the core inflation is excluding food and energy. So if you ask, on average, are people better off? The answer is yes, wages have grown, meaning have outgrown inflation, meaning purchasing power is higher now than it was in peak Trump. And that blue line, even though it got close to the red line here, cumulatively, that blue line has always been above the red line throughout the Biden era. And let me share this another way. I'll explain it another way. This is the actual wage itself. So this is hourly wage adjusted for inflation. So this is dollars per hour for that bottom 80% of the private sector, always above 2019 or above 2019 and 2020, that Feb 2020 number. Here's the line. We never got below it. This peak you can ignore it. It's garbage. What happened is millions of low wage workers lost their jobs while the richer people kept their jobs. This average spiked and that reversed almost immediately in here. Okay. And so it turns out that 2021 actually had the highest real wages ever. For data back to 1964, this is purchasing power. So purchasing power was as high in a year as it's ever been in 2021. Now, what happened in the news media is they started talking about this downward trend from this fake peak to here. And they said, inflation's killing us. Our real wages, our purchasing power is falling. That is a lie. Okay. To tell the truth with data, you need to do two things. You need to say the facts, and you need to put it in context. They were just giving you facts. This number's down. Yeah, but the context is this number's not real, and this number is extremely high historically, better than it was even in February 2020, peak Trump, before the pandemic, we've always had more purchasing power than back then. So when people say we're having an inflation crisis, I've been saying, what inflation crisis? And so right now, this number, 30.57 an hour, is the highest it's ever been, except for this fake peak. And so you could say with a caveat, with a asterisk, we have the most purchasing power. The wages have the most purchasing power for data back to 1964.
Reading from the BLS monthly employment report
Yep.
for April of 2020, the change in total non-farm payroll employment. In April, average hourly earnings for all employees on private non-farm payrolls increased by $1.34 to 30.01. Average hourly earnings of private sector production and non-supervisory employees increased by $1.04 to 25.12. The increases in average hourly earnings largely reflect the substantial job loss among lower paid workers. This change, along with earnings increases, put upward pressure on the average. But basically, it's what you were saying. It was a lot of low wage people lost their jobs.
And the economists were very clear about this, and it's right there in the news releases. Everybody knew this, but the media got a lot more drama by saying, "Whoa, look at this. This number's coming down. People are losing purchasing power." And it's like, well, yeah, it dipped a little bit, but it was still better than 2019. They didn't say that. They didn't say it was better than 2019 or 2020, Feb 2020, better than pre-pandemic, and they didn't say it's near the highest it's ever been in our history. They didn't say that. And that's part of the lying that the media has been doing. And I'm not talking about red media. I'm not talking about Fox News. I mean, New York Times, Washington Post. They all got on this purchasing power is falling kick when in fact it's better than pre-pandemic. They lied to us. And it was a big part of, I think, if to the extent this election was about economics, and those of you that have heard me say this, I think it was more about immigration. But if to the extent you believe it was about about economics, that lie did a lot of damage to the Democrats. And not only that, but I just talked about the average for the bottom 80%. The people at the bottom of the spectrum got even bigger wage increases. And think of this as when the pandemic hit, people lost their job at McDonald's and then they went to work or at restaurants and hotels, and they went to work in the Amazon warehouses making a lot more money. Think of that as what the phenomenon was in here for a lot of that bottom fifth of the workforce. But again, this is real wages. So this is your purchasing power up relative to, this is exactly December 2019. So almost the same period I just shared, Feb 2020 and December 2023. We're better off. Now, to the question that was brought up earlier around, kind of put this in context for me. Here are the presidents, the last 11 presidents. Here's the unemployment rate. So you want it to be low. So you want to be down here in the unemployment rate. And this is the average for their whole administration. And then here's the hourly wage, which is that chart I just showed you, this one. Biden is the best of any president. Trump is close. You can't see it in the chart I shared, but if you go back a long ways on this chart, this red line falls a lot and then it rises back in the 1970s. It's sort of a big U shape going back in time. And that's why Nixon is right here with Trump, not just because they're both criminals, but because they happen to be, there were very good real wages under Nixon and also a very strong economy there in the 60s and early 70s. So Nixon actually comes out very well on this, but Obama not so well because he had high unemployment. He was the hangover from Bush 43. Bush 43 didn't get punished as much because it was right at the end of his administration that the unemployment rate started rising. And so you're seeing that Biden is right up here. I guess some of you would probably be surprised because Reagan has this reputation as being this economic superhero, right? I mean, things just were not, he just did not have very good real wages. Purchasing power was low under Reagan. It had been falling from the 70s down into the 80s. It actually fell into the mid 90s before it started coming back. And since the mid 90s, it's been strengthening. But part of that was what Reagan did with deregulation, and Carter did a little bit too. But some of the deregulation, the union busting, that created a lot more corporate power. And so you saw the lower real wages under Reagan. Plus, you had very high inflation that the wages didn't keep up with. That was another part of it as well. Bush 41 was the worst, but here's Biden, one of the best among the last 11 presidents on these measures. And these aren't little podunk measures. This is the unemployment rate and the real wage. These are hugely consequential measures. Now, here's a real interesting study that got very minimal press coverage, but was unbelievably critical for what was actually happening. This puts the nail in the coffin of the sort of inflation crisis idea. The Congressional Budget Office, our most credible source of analysis, said incomes outgrew inflation across all income quintiles. So quintile is 20%. So the bottom 20%, the next 20%, those are quintiles. Fifths, all of them had more purchasing power. And the chart on the right's a little confusing. What it basically says, down is better. It says this is the share of your income needed to purchase the same stuff you bought in 2019. So you needed less of your income, a lesser share of your income, to buy the same stuff that you bought in 2019. CBO reports this stuff. They don't have a marketing arm. It's not their job. Did Democrats get on this and really talk about it? Not really. But what it says is that you had more purchasing power in 2023 than 2019, no matter what happened with rents and no matter what happened with the price of eggs or cars or oil or gas, whatever, income outgrew it. Nobody knew this, but it happened not just for the rich, it was across the income spectrum. This is net worth per household real. Real, whenever you see that word real, that's adjusted for inflation. This is the bottom 50% wealth group. The wealth of that group was about 37,000 before the pandemic. It rose nicely under Trump. And then it really spiked up during the pandemic. The pandemic didn't hurt net worth because the stock market went through it very well. And so did housing prices also jumped. And so the adjusted for inflation, the wealth got to 61,000, almost 61.5, and it's been moving sideways since then as housing prices have come down. The stock market came down a bit. Now it's going back up again. I would expect to see Q3. This data lags a few months. I would expect to see the Q3 data very soon. It could be any day. And then the Q4 data should be back in record territory again. By the end of 2024, this number should be above that 61,496. It should be up here somewhere. So we'll see. But just to point out that if you're thinking the economy is a disaster, I just showed you that real wages and unemployment were the lowest of any president under Biden on average, and that people got the richest ever under Biden. Here in Q1 22, he'd been a president for about a year when that happened. For the next 40% group, so this is the middle and upper class, not the richest, but the next group, peaked also around the same time at 900,000 and have moved sideways and caught up a little bit more because this group has more stock. They're not just housing as much, but they're more stock is a bigger part of their portfolios. 21% richer than before the pandemic. So doing very well. Americans became the richest ever under Biden is a quote you didn't hear anywhere, and I think we should have told people that. So let's pause. Let's catch up on the chat if there's anything else we got here.
Does average net worth include both retirement accounts and the value of the house?
Yes.
Oh.
Yep. Yeah, it includes everything. What it doesn't include, though, and Karl's pointed this out in the past, is that the value of Social Security and Medicare, what that tends to do is equalize things. Meaning, if you were to treat that as an asset, that would tend to improve inequality and make people look a little richer. But this is just, it's basically your stock portfolio, any savings you have. It also includes things that might surprise you, like it's your house, but also it includes your car. That's an asset that's in there. And then any liabilities you have is taken out of net worth. So that would be things like, your mortgage on your home or credit card debt and all that stuff. That's all taken out of here. But why did this bottom 50% group jump so much? A lot of that was they couldn't spend during the pandemic on stuff, and then they got all the checks. 1,400 per adult in the household. You had the child tax credit, 1,000 or more for every kid in the household. Many households got $10,000 worth of stuff from the Rescue Act, and this bumped that net worth up nicely because people didn't have a place to spend it. And the stock market, there is some of that in the bottom 50%, but the house prices is the most is the biggest part of that gain was mostly real estate. I'm just looking
What
through.
about Oldham?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
This goes back to what you were saying this a few minutes ago. I guess it still may go with it, but I've just got through reading the December issue of AARP bulletin, and they're on page 4. It talks about Social Security checks will be a small bump that will get an extra $45. But then you have to come over to the next column and read that $45 actually is going to go away for Medicare. So it's not enough to to say grace over, but we're going to get something, but it's taken away whenever they increase the Medicare costs. So if you all get opportunity, if you get AARP and read that, it's on page 4 at the front of the paper about this bump. Could it be in jeopardy with this new man coming back? Well, it's old new man coming into office.
Yeah, I mean, I have to learn more about that piece on Medicare. I mean, the premiums are going up, doesn't surprise me. And I think I read the COLA for Social Security is like 2.5%.
Correct.
Is coming up, if I'm not mistaken. So I would say this, though. I mean, on the other question around the Social Security, is it going to be there and all that? I mean, if you change nothing, Social Security will be cut somewhere in 20-ish% in the early 2030s. And that's if the law is unchanged. Like if we don't add more funding to it, we don't change the tax revenue going in, that's what's going to happen. So it isn't that Social Security goes bankrupt or goes away. It's that it's only allowed to take the current tax revenues that go in. And then there's also this thing called the trust fund, which will be reduced to zero by 2030 something, early 2030s, in which case then there's only about enough to pay about 80% of the current benefits schedule. I don't think either party's going to let that happen. And even I don't see that the Republicans getting away with cutting elderly Social Security by 20%. It would take Democrats would have to be even more inept than I think we are to allow that to be blamed on us and not on them, if they were in charge. But I say a piece of good news is it doesn't take a ton to fully finance Social Security. You remove the cap, which is 160 something right now, and that gets you about 2/3 of the way there. I think we covered a little. If I didn't cover Social Security in this one, I think we did it. Well, we're due for so no, it's in here. We'll talk a little bit about Social Security in a minute. So let me defer that, but don't lose sleep over Social Security down the road. I think that's going to get fixed. But this piece you just mentioned on if Medicare premiums are going up, could that cut into your income? Absolutely, it could. Yeah.
Well,
And I don't think that's Trump's doing. I think that's just. I don't think that's his fault. I think that's just that's where things are right now.
Well, didn't all this come about during Bush 2? Because I hate hearing people keep on saying that this is an entitlement. We paid into it, and we're still continuing to pay into it, even after you start receiving Social Security. You're not getting you've paid whatever you paid when you work, and then now you continue to pay even though you're not working.
Right. Yeah. It's not you earned it. You earned Social Security that. But again, that's part of the Republican marketing. They let that word. They use those words. Words have power, and we don't counteract it. We always call the payroll tax a tax when in fact it's really a contribution, right? You're contributing to your pension, but we call it a tax. And so there's.
They want to call it the entitlement. And didn't we get in dire straits with this during the Bush 2 era? Didn't he borrow money from Social Security?
That's not new. No, that's not his fault. And that shouldn't affect the finances of the program. People don't need to be worried about that. The explanation is a little technical on how the Social Security Trust Fund works, but the basic idea is that whether you put the money in a lockbox or you don't, and the government borrows and spends it, it still owes the money to Social Security. Social Security has a legal claim to grab that money back. So it isn't that they need to pass a law to pay Social Security back. It will grab that money on its own. It doesn't need a new law to do that. So it will, if you borrow from Social Security, think of it as Social Security has the power to just grab that back. And so don't that idea of put it in a lockbox or save it, it never truly mattered. Even though the lockbox ID was pretty cool, don't worry, but that isn't the issue. Rating the lockbox or rating Social Security, it confuses the real economics of the issue. But we do have to do something to put more money into Social Security or cut benefits if we want to pay some new benefits schedule. And I think, we'll talk about it in a little bit here. So let me hold off on further Social Security stuff. I've got a couple slides on it coming up. All right, let's proceed here. So the CBO report on income inequality. CBO advises the Congress, so they are the ones describe the effects of legislation on the economy and the budget, and they are considered nonpartisan, impartial. They are the umpire in the scoring of legislation, and in fact, their leader is a Republican. So it's not something that you can trust this data. It's as good as it's going to get. Your Congressional Budget Office is a national treasure, and they do fantastic work. And they are an underappreciated part of the deep state, which I hope nobody touches. So they do a lot of different reports. Karl mentioned earlier they do one on the budget. That data that we shared on the budget is from them. They do this report. The one thing about this report is the data lags a little bit. It's from 2021 is the latest data. It takes a while to get the IRS data organized in the way that they need. And so then they do all their work to put it together. It's a very involved piece of analysis, but we can learn a lot from that because 2021 was the end of the pandemic. We can see the effects that all this government assistance had on inequality. And every piece of data I'm going to share with you is adjusted for inflation, meaning the numbers are comparable. And the way they do this is they have what's called before taxes and transfers, which is sort of what you make before taxes are taken out and before the government transfers stuff like through Social Security, giving you money, or any other welfare or any other kind of dollar transfer from the government. It's sort of your pure market income. And then there's after taxes and transfers. So that's after all the other transfers and welfare and all the income that somebody has. So here is before transfers and taxes. And you see that everybody has this is the percent increase. Again, everything's adjusted for inflation. These numbers were flat until about the mid 90s for the bottom quintile. Remember, is 20% of the population. So this is the bottom. There's the middle 60%. Here is the bottom 20%. The numbers went up into the late 90s, and then under Bush, they fell for a while. And then they came back before the Great Recession and then fell again. And then now hit a peak very recently toward the end of the Trump administration and then fell a little bit for the lowest quintile, but middle quintiles continued to do pretty well. So they're up, both groups are up, 25%-ish, maybe 30% for the middle. But there hasn't been a lot of forward movement since the Clinton era, right? If you look at that red line kind of I drew in, for that lowest quintile hasn't made much forward progress for the last 30 years. Again, this is before transfers and taxes. The purchasing power of the bottom 20% has not moved very much after, coming up 25%. It's been sort of flat since then. When you look at the still before income, this is still before transfers and taxes, but this is the upper group now. This is a breakout of that top of the food chain. So the top 20% parts of it, you can see they're all doing extremely well. And the further up you get, you see these giant increases in income for the top 1%. This is when people talk about inequality, this is where they talk about it with the top 1%. And even beyond that, the top 0.1% just running away from the rest of the group. Again, this is we're in the top 20% here only. The other groups are, would barely register on the scale. You'd barely be able to tell they're different from zero. If you went back here, you'd barely be able to tell these are different from zero on this scale. Now, switching to after taxes and transfers, though, the story is very different. The lowest quintile has done extremely well, almost as well as the highest quintile. And that's because of very generous transfers and taxes that have happened over the years. The idea that the middle class has been falling behind, sort of the Bernie Sanders story, that's this red line here. But it's partially true because it's not really true, when you look at the after taxes and transfers situation, which is way better. The lowest quintile, 125% increase, 100% is double, meaning the purchasing power of that lowest quintile has doubled from where they were in the early 80s. So back here in the Reagan era, The lowest quintiles got double the purchasing power it had in the Reagan era, thanks to these transfers and taxes. And the highest quintile is not running away from the lowest quintile very much in this scale. And the middle three quintiles actually are kind of in the middle. They literally are lower than the lowest quintile. Though the poor really benefit from that, have really benefited from the transfers and taxes that the government is delivering. So that's a very big success story for sort of the progressive strategy. Here is a comparison of what's been going on since 2019. And this is the left side is before taxes and transfers. The right side is after taxes and transfers, just since the pandemic. So only over a 2-year window, 2019, 2021. Well, it would be from the end of 2019 through 20 and 21. You see the highest quintile doing very well, but the other groups not before taxes and transfers, just flat for the middle class. But after taxes and transfers, really big increases for all, again, because of these very big government stimulus programs that happened. You saw big increases in the income, the purchasing power in 2021. That was Biden's first year in office. And you got it in 2020 as well. Trump, with the CARES Act, put a lot of money in pockets as well during the pandemic. So it's a story of, it's sort of two stories. Before taxes, there's a term you'll hear sometimes if you nerd out on this stuff called pre-distribution. That's this. Pre-distribution is the idea that government can do policies to address inequality, to address this before taxes and transfers situation by things like strengthening unions, higher minimum wage, education initiatives. Those are things that, in theory, allow the bottom groups to catch up in terms of competing and getting more pay before transfers and taxes to sort of tighten up this big gap between the highest quintile and the rest. That's called pre-distribution. And this one is redistribution, the idea that you can do stuff like the Affordable Care Act, which raises taxes on the rich, pays benefits to the poor. Those are things that improve the inequality situation. And what you see here is that the inequality situation is pretty good, much better after taxes and transfers than before. That's the redistribution strategy. I am a big fan of using the redistribution strategy. Raise taxes on the rich, give the money and benefits for education, healthcare, or whatever BBB stuff. Give that to the poor and the middle class, and don't worry so much about the pre-distribution because it's never really worked all that well. We haven't had much success with it, no matter what we've tried for 30-something years. But we've had a lot of success with this. Let's keep doing it. There's another concept you'll run into sometimes called the Gini coefficient, and it goes from 0 to 1. 1 means more inequality, meaning the rich have all the money. It's a way of simplifying it. The richest guy would have all the money at a Gini coefficient of 1, and everybody would have the same amount of money at a Gini of 0. And as you would expect, market income is the most unequal. And then as the government starts doing more and more stuff, the Gini coefficient goes down. In other words, things get more equal as the government does more. That shouldn't surprise anybody. That's the purpose of a sort of progressive kind of state. So there has been a lot of success in this area, as we saw here, and it works. And this jump, when you see this big jump, probably for the lowest quintile, a lot of that's the Affordable Care Act, was definitely a big piece of that. Another piece, this says the reduction in inequality, so the effect on the Gini coefficient of government transfers, and you can see here, as you would expect, that the Gini coefficient, it's a larger reduction in the Gini coefficient. Things get more equal when the federal government acts on it and does the taxes and redistribution. So questions on the inequality stuff? Let's look at the chat.
I just looked up what the Part B premiums are going to be. In 2024 for Medicare Part B, premiums were $174.10 a month, and in 2025 they're going to be $185 a month. And most of us, if you're like me, got your statement on that this week.
Thank you, Karl.
They didn't check mail yesterday. It came in either yesterday or today in my mail.
All right. I'm just looking here. All right, we're going to do a little bit on Social Security here. So sort of our last section is really not quite last, but mostly Here's another slide to get back to a point that was brought up earlier that puts a lot of numbers in context. Inflation from the fourth quarter of 2019 through the second quarter of 2024 was 21%. Hourly wages, home prices, GDP, net worth of the different groups in the stock market have all far outgrown inflation during that time. And I use the pre-pandemic as my benchmark because if you start messing around with analyzing data in the middle of the pandemic, it throws things off really badly. It doesn't throw it off as badly with the net worth and stock market because they kind of went through. But when you talk about some of the other things, they got really distorted by the pandemic. So this is, I think, the fairest way to measure it. Bear in mind, Q4 19 was the greatest economy. It was the best quarter of Trump, sort of Trump's best quarter. And, one of the best economies the US ever had. And look at how far we've come since then. Far outstripping inflation on all these key measures of household income. And then the GDP is the income, it's the production and income in the economy, is a way of thinking about it, has far outgrown inflation. When you hear the GDP has grown 2% or 3%, that's real GDP growth from quarter to quarter, annualized. These are cumulative increases over that time. So this is a phenomenal success story. I mean, these are unbelievable numbers. And if you've got a stock portfolio, you are absolutely thrilled with how things have gone over the past 5 years or so. I mean, you are rocking. Your money's basically doubled, and that is a good thing. If you got a 401k, you're nearing retirement, and you had a lot in the S&P 500 index fund, which a lot of people do. That has been a huge win. This is another one that has a lot of numbers on the same page, but puts everything in context together. This shows 3 points in time before the pandemic. So that fourth quarter, and some of these numbers are quarterly, some of them are monthly. So either Feb 20 or Q4 19. So this is pre-pandemic, near the Trump peak. This is when Biden starts. So that's sort of 2/3 of the way through the pandemic. And then the Biden latest data. And the 12 of the 12 measures are better than when Biden started. And bear in mind, that's a low bar because it was in the pandemic, right? So when you say, there's the famous question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? It's like, well, duh, obviously that was the pandemic. But we're actually better off on 8 of the 12 measures than even before the pandemic. Like, we're about 7 million jobs better than we were before the pandemic. The unemployment rate is one that isn't better. It's a little bit higher than before the pandemic. The job opportunity ratio, which was what we talked about earlier about the ratio of open jobs to unemployed, it's a little bit lower, but not much different. But then when you get into the GDP per person, or all of these measures of how households are doing, they're all better than Trump's best. Except this guy right here last month just dropped to below where it was back then, but it's just a little bit lower. The other ones are all better. And then the budget deficit's a little bit higher. So there's 4 of these measures that are worse. The rest of them are all better, especially like these net worth and real wage and all these household measures are better. So you want context. It's not a pretty picture. You have to look at it. It's a lot of data, but 8 of 12 better than pre-pandemic, 12 of 12 better than when Biden started. That's a pretty good way of thinking about how the economy is doing. The growth rate in GDP, no matter how you slice it, faster under Biden than Trump, even before the pandemic, although very close to where Trump was before the pandemic, right about the same. The New York Times, and I'll show you here in a second, the New York Times said that growth under Biden has been sluggish. And I just shook my head when I saw that. Let me see, was it sluggish or... Sorry, yeah, sluggish. I'll come back to it. They said it's sluggish, but 3% growth is actually very robust. And so when I say the media is lying to us, even the mainstream media is lying, I'm not sure exactly why. I can't read their minds. I can just tell you that they're telling a story that is false, and they are people that know better. They all know that 3% GDP growth is excellent, and they know that's what the number is, and they still said the growth is sluggish, and not in op-eds, in the journalism section. So, but this is excellent growth that Biden has had. And by the way, real GDP had regained the peak by the first quarter of 2021 when Biden started. So it isn't like he's getting a huge benefit from, being at the bottom of a trough and then coming up. It had already recovered to that pre-pandemic level when Biden started. Unlike jobs, the GDP had already recovered by the time Biden started. The US has done better than other countries. This is the cumulative growth in GDP, real GDP, so adjusted for inflation. And this is the inflation over here. The US is actually much faster growth, comparable inflation to the rest of the developed European economies, and Japan is in here too. So, this is a great story as well. We've recovered much better than the rest of the world's economies. Again, this goes from that end of 2019 to the first quarter of 2024. If you don't follow them, the Council of Economic Advisors is on Twitter. They don't have a huge following, but they do great charts. Every time there's a news release, you're going to get great charts from them. And even Trump's group, they'll be a little more suspect than Trump's, but they tend to be, the culture at the CEA tends to be more matter of fact and not a sales organization. As much as I would like them to sell this, they just sort of put it out there. Labor productivity is another great story, which is that the output per worker or per hour has grown more quickly in the US than in other parts of the world, which is part of why you saw that GDP number that was so much better, why the US dot is way out here. So the productivity of the economy is really solid. And this bars show different time periods. The last couple of years, the 2 years before that, and then going back like 10 or 12 years. And this is a much wider window. This one is 13 years versus 2 or 3 for these. But still, it shows that this is very good productivity. Part of my theory on that is a lot of it is immigrants coming in. We brought in a lot of young, motivated workers to do this stuff. Here is the New York Times journalism section just the other day saying how this 3-arrow approach of the new Treasury Secretary coming in, and that the U.S. economy, to jump starting. So in other words, we're dead in the water, right? Our engine is dead. Jump starting a U.S. economy that has been saddled with inflation and sluggish output. I mean, how negative a sentence is that in their journalism section when none of that is really true? We're not saddled with inflation because wages and net worth have far outgrown it. The output is not sluggish, and we are definitely not in need of a jump start. So this is the journalism section. This is from their top economics writers writing this garbage. It really makes me angry because they know they're lying. And this is the New York Times. It's embarrassing for them. They should be fired for this kind of garbage. And they just keep getting away with it. Not that I have a view on that. So now in terms of inflation itself, this is the monthly reporting. It started to pick up a little bit. We had this 0.2%. This is how much prices have gone up versus a month earlier. So prices were 0.3% higher in November than they were in October after being 0.2 for the last 4 months, then even a negative month. Prices actually fell in June a little bit. We do not want to see that. Obviously, we want to see that number being at the 0.2 or lower, but 1 month does not a trend make. Let's see what happens. Most of this is rent. Rent is like half. You can use it as a sort of a round number. Rent is about half of what's happening with inflation. I think in the latest month, it was 40% of the monthly increase, but over the past year, it's been about half. So when you see inflation, just think it's rent. And be glad if you own a home because you don't have to deal with it. This is versus a year earlier. So each point is measured versus a year earlier. How much higher are prices versus a year? And 2.7 is for the all measure. So every item is in there, and that's gone up the past couple of months, while the core is flat. And the core excludes food and energy. So it's all items less food and energy. And then the all is all items. So we don't like to see the blue come up, but the good news is the core has been flat. So that's, the Fed has a goal of 2%. So it wants to see those lower, but these aren't the exact measures the Fed uses. They use another measure for inflation called the PCE. It tends to run about half a point lower than this. It hasn't always done that lately, but think about it as if the goal is to be at 2.0 PCE inflation, we're probably at around 2.75 right now on that measure. So we're still a little high for where the Fed wants us. This gives you all the details. You can see the price of food and all the stuff. All these are, each column is months. So this item here that I've highlighted in red for food at home was a pretty big jump versus last month, up 0.5%. So your $100 bill became $100.50. Is that right, Karl? Am I doing the math right? 0.5%. 1% would be 101. Yep. So 50-cent increase in the food prices on $100. But in the past year, groceries haven't been the big problem. Food away from home, people going out more. That's a sign of affluence that restaurants are able to raise prices that much. You can see most of these things are green because they're not very much. I guess I should have made that one not green, but oops, excuse me. But most of these, the green ones are good. The red is bad. This is rent. These are not all weighted equally in the measure. Shelter is where the real problem is. I could put a big circle around shelter. That is the big problem. Is that guy? We can't get this number down for whatever reason. They keep jacking up rents. And this just tells you kind of what's been driving inflation over the past few years. And it's interesting in that it is the thing that's been driving inflation changed. Like originally, you couldn't go out, and so people were just buying goods. And so the goods prices jump. That's this, which one is it? The dark blue is the goods. But you see, that's not the issue anymore. Lately, it's been housing. Wasn't the issue at first. But then people started working from home. They wanted bigger offices. We had a large creation and number of households jumped. A lot of people left their basements and went to create their families. And so housing had a huge, big increase in demand. And so you had a big increase in prices. Energy was a big problem at first when we started driving again. And then now it's actually been a negative. It's actually helped us. So it's really, I think this is fascinating in terms of the story of what happened during the pandemic. You could see it in the inflation measure. And lately it's this dark blue and then some of the services because people have money and they're out spending it. And at a fundamental level, I said this before, not today, but you can't have inflation if people don't have the money to buy the stuff. The price can't go up. A retailer can't raise the prices if nobody buys it. They'll just have to lower those prices right back down again. People have the money. Why? Because they got a lot of checks from the government, or they got big wage increases, or they saved a lot during the pandemic. And that's why a big part of it, it's not just us. You got inflation all over the world as we came out of this pandemic, as the supply chains got unsnarled and repaired. People could go back to work making stuff again and servicing. It's just, you just can't have inflation without money in the system. On Social Security, what this shows is that, and let me step back, just to be clear about when Karl and I talk about percent of GDP, these numbers get gigantic, trillions and hundreds of billions, especially when you look at them over 10 years. The way the CBO and others analyze it is they divide by the size of the economy to make numbers comparable from year to year. And so what the CBO and others say is that the revenue under current law is about 4.7% of GDP, but Social Security is going to cost about 6.4% of GDP on average over the next 75 years. And so that gap, 6.4 minus 4.7 is 1.7. And so the question is, how do you bridge that? If you were to remove the cap on the payroll tax, which is 168,000 this year, and you don't give people more benefits, that covers 1.1% of GDP of that gap. And for numbers' sake, 1.1% of GDP is somewhere around $300 billion a year. So it reduces the deficit and it helps fund Social Security at the same time. It's right at the top of my wish list, along with lowering the Medicare age, of things that are both practical and incredibly impactful. These are my big two. And this gets you most of the way there. Then you can raise taxes a little bit on everybody if you want, or you could be creative and divert some other kind of funding in there, like a wealth tax would be awesome. And then, you can do that. You just have to cover that remaining 0.6 if you remove the cap. So raising the payroll tax by 1 percentage point would get you 0.3. But to put that in scale, you don't want to raise taxes on the middle class if you can avoid it. And so removing the cap really hits the top 6% of earners. The 168 and up is the top 6% only make more than that. And if you remove the cap, you're not taxing the first 168,000 any differently. You're only taxing the dollars above that. And that still gets you 2/3 of the way to your target. And it's a tremendously I think, no-brainer policy to do. It would have been a great policy, even more, not just lowering the deficit, funding Social Security, only hitting the top of the spectrum, but it also, how would I put it? What was it? It would have helped deal with inflation a little bit because that group making over 168 was the one they do the lion's share of the spending. So that also would take a little money out of their pocket, which would have helped take the edge off that inflation a little bit. It was a perfect policy to implement in that 2022, 2023 timeframe when the economy was just at its absolute peak. We didn't. That was a missed opportunity. But politically, it's just going to be when the issue gets forced down the road, they're going to do something like this. And another piece on inequality, what this says is what percent of the nation's earnings are above the cap. And because you've got some rich people earning a lot more of the money, more of the Social Security payroll tax base is above the cap. So it used to be only 10% was above the cap. Now it's 18% is above the cap. And so that's just another justification for removing that cap and just basically moving this number up to 100%. Just everybody gets, it's everyone. So this is another way of measuring inequality, is this lowering this tax base, more and more of it going above the Social Security cap and not being taxed. It's sort of another kind of tax benefit for the rich. All right, so that we got only if you want to write the DNC, here's how you do it. Because if you write your senator, they'll send you to the senator's campaign. So if you want to, most of them, their campaign site also has an easy email that you can send to them. But just when you don't expect to get when you send it to the senator, like if I sent a note to Durbin, that's how I know this. He sent me a note back saying I can't use what you sent me. You got to send it to my campaign. So just so you know. These are a couple of slides I thought the Biden administration did that were pretty good. They didn't cover their best talking points, but they've got some good ones. This was a good one right here, which I'm glad they used it. Lowest average unemployment rate in 50 years. He's implying for the whole presidency, his average across the presidency. I showed you that statistic. I think that's a great one. Job creation, the Republicans and the media sort of downplay that number because they say, well, yeah, a lot of those were the recovery. So the 7 million above pre-pandemic peak is how I would have said that. But the GDP growth is a great number. And he should have said real there. But again, your average person doesn't know what these numbers mean. I shared a slide with you where I said that GDP growth has been like 32%. That's nominal after inflation. That's where you get to 12.6. That's very robust growth in the time that he's been a president. Income's up 4,000 after adjusting for inflation. That's a great stat. That's what they're using that. It's that real wage times hours. That's one way they can get at it. Times two for two couples probably. So it's a couple thousand per worker is what that extra dollar something an hour means for real wages. So he's got a list of things here. And then there's a few about the small business boom, which there's a lot of small business people that tend to be Republican and maybe independents. And so he's saying, here's what I'm doing for you. Trump did a lot for those people too with his tax cuts. And so here are some sources for additional information. You can read up on this if you're struggling to understand the things that we talked about. If I can tell you that if you keep coming to these meetings, they will start to make sense. You'll get used to these numbers. There are also sources here that you can read for the long forms. And when these, I would encourage you also to read. You can read the jobs report that comes out every month. It's the first Friday of the month. It's called the BLS employment situation. You can read it in English and you can learn a lot from studying that. And then the inflation report comes out. It's less useful, but I think that jobs report is the one that I think is a good civic thing to learn. Again, it's called the BLS employment situation, and it's covered. I mean, it gets wall-to-wall coverage on that first Friday of every month. And so, you can find it pretty easily. Also, there's a couple of sources on here that'll send you to articles that talk about how the economy does much better under Democrats. And Karl and I have shared presentations. We have a presentation on just that subject, but you can find it if you follow me on Twitter, David Doney, Doney. It's my pinned tweet is on it has a bunch of slides about how the economy does better under Democrats, so you can't miss it, right at the top of my page. And there's a Wikipedia article called U.S. Economic Performance Under Democratic and Republican Presidents that explains all this. And I started that article on Wikipedia, and then a lot of other people have expanded it. It's a pretty darn good article now, and has, a couple dozen sources explaining how this is the case, and it's a great source if you want to always be able to go get sources for it. So that ends our prepared remarks.